There is a particular kind of darkness that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with thunder or with warning. It comes instead wearing the face of promise, speaking the language of dreams, carrying the warm light of opportunity in its hands. And we lean toward it, as all living things lean toward warmth, because that is simply what we do. That is the oldest and most human of vulnerabilities, the willingness to believe that someone, somewhere, has found a way to make the world more generous than it actually is. This is a story about that darkness. It is a story about a man named Malekzadeh and about the architecture of deception that he constructed over years, brick by careful brick, until it towered high enough to cast a long shadow over the lives of the people who trusted him. It is not a story that belongs only to its victims, though they are its true center, its moral weight, its reason for being told at all. It is a story that belongs to all of us, because the conditions that made it possible, the hunger for financial security, the seduction of insider knowledge, the social pressure of community trust, these conditions exist everywhere, in every time, in every circle of human association. To understand what Malekzadeh did, you must first understand the world he moved through. He operated primarily within the Iranian-American community, a diaspora shaped by displacement and by the particular anxieties that displacement creates. These were people who had rebuilt their lives from almost nothing, who had carried their families across oceans and borders, who had worked with the kind of ferocious dedication that only those who have lost everything once can fully understand. They had constructed businesses, raised children, accumulated modest savings. They had done everything right. And because they had done everything right, they were looking, as anyone in their position might look, for a way to protect what they had built, for a way to make it grow, for someone they could trust. Malekzadeh presented himself as exactly that person. He cultivated an image of success with considerable care and considerable skill. He dressed well. He spoke confidently about financial instruments and investment strategies with the fluency of someone who had spent years inside the machinery of wealth. He name-dropped institutions and individuals in ways that suggested deep connections to the legitimate world of finance. He understood, perhaps better than almost anyone, that the appearance of credibility is itself a form of credibility. That if you can make people feel they are in the presence of someone who knows, they will transfer their own uncertainty onto you and fill it with faith. He used the mechanisms of community trust with particular effectiveness. Within the Iranian-American social networks where he operated, word of mouth carries enormous weight. Reputation travels through family gatherings and cultural events and religious connections, and the dense web of relationships that any close-knit community maintains. When one respected member of that community speaks well of you, their endorsement opens doors that no advertising could open. And Malekzadeh understood this. He cultivated early investors carefully, ensuring that they received returns in the beginning, returns that were not generated by any real investment activity, but simply taken from the money that later investors would bring in. This is the fundamental mechanism of the Ponzi scheme, a structure as old as modern finance and as reliably destructive as any weapon ever devised. The term Ponzi scheme carries the name of Charles Ponzi, the Italian-born swindler who, in the early 1920s, convinced thousands of Americans that he had found a way to exploit international postal reply coupons for extraordinary profit. He had not. What he had found was something far simpler and far more terrible. That if you pay early investors with the money of later investors, and if word of the returns spreads widely enough to keep attracting new money, you can sustain the illusion almost indefinitely, right up to the moment you cannot. The mathematics are merciless and inevitable. The scheme must always collapse. It is not a question of if, but only of when. And the longer it runs, the more catastrophic the collapse. Malekzadeh's operation bore all the hallmarks of this structure. He promised returns that were consistently higher than what legitimate investment vehicles could reasonably offer. This is always the first and most reliable warning sign. When someone promises you returns that the market itself cannot justify, they are either lying to you or they are gambling with your money in ways so reckless that the outcome is almost the same thing. Malekzadeh's promised returns were attractive enough to be compelling and just plausible enough to avoid immediate skepticism. He was careful in this calibration. He understood that greed alone would not sustain the illusion. that the numbers had to feel like expertise rather than fantasy. He also deployed a set of psychological techniques that are common to fraud of this kind, but no less effective for their familiarity. He created a sense of exclusivity around his investment opportunities. Not everyone could participate. You are fortunate, he implied, to be in a position to be considered. This is an ancient manipulation. The suggestion that you are among the chosen few, that access itself is a form of privilege that should not be squandered. It activates a fear of missing out that can overwhelm the quieter voice of caution. He also used social proof relentlessly, citing the satisfaction of existing investors, referencing the returns they had received, creating a landscape of success in which skepticism itself began to feel like a kind of failure of imagination. The victims who came forward, when the full dimensions of the scheme began to become visible, described experiences that are heartbreaking in their consistency. They spoke of having trusted him completely. Some had known him for years, had attended the same events, had eaten at the same tables, had watched their children grow up alongside his acquaintances. The betrayal was not merely financial. It was the betrayal of a shared world, of a community's faith in itself, of the belief that the relationships you build across a lifetime mean something, that they constitute a form of protection. They do not protect you from this. Nothing social or emotional protects you from this. That is part of what makes fraud of this particular kind so devastating and so long-lasting in its damage. The amounts that individuals lost varied, but many lost savings that had taken decades to accumulate. Some had invested retirement funds. Some had persuaded other family members to invest. This is one of the cruelest multiplicative effects of affinity fraud, the mechanism by which the betrayal spreads through families like a contagion, so that the person who is first deceived becomes, without any malicious intent, an instrument of deception for the people they love most. Imagine carrying that weight. Imagine the conversation across a kitchen table where you must explain to your elderly parent, or your sibling, or your lifelong friend that the money they gave you to invest because they trusted your judgment is gone. Not diminished, not underperforming, gone. The regulatory and legal machinery that eventually engaged with Malekzadeh's activities moved, as such machinery always moves, more slowly than the harm it sought to address. This is not a criticism unique to any particular jurisdiction or institution. It is simply the nature of financial fraud that it is extraordinarily difficult to detect in its early stages, precisely because it is designed to look legitimate. The paperwork is real, the statements are real, the faces of authority and competence are real. What is not real is the underlying activity, the actual deployment of capital into productive investment, the genuine generation of returns. The gap between the appearance and the reality is where the fraud lives, and closing that gap requires either a whistleblower or the inevitable collapse of the mathematics. There were people who had doubts. There are almost always people who have doubts. But doubt within a community where trust is highly valued comes with social costs. To question someone who is vouched for by people you respect is, implicitly, to question the judgment of those people. It risks social friction. It risks being seen as cynical or ungrateful or somehow insufficiently trusting. The social penalties for skepticism are real, and they function as a kind of enforcement mechanism for the fraud, though entirely unwittingly on the part of those who impose them. This is one of the most insidious aspects of affinity fraud. It weaponizes the very virtues of the community it exploits. Trust becomes a vulnerability. Loyalty becomes a trap. The closer the community, the more effective the exploitation. Let us sit for a moment with the specific texture of what these victims experienced as the scheme began to unravel. For some, the first sign was a delay. A return that was expected on a particular date did not arrive. Malekzadeh offered explanations. A processing issue. A temporary market disruption. Something technical and plausible that asked only for patience. Patience was given. Then another delay. Then explanations that became slightly less specific, slightly more vague. Then a phone call that was not returned. Then a door that did not open as easily as it once had. Then the terrible, slow accumulation of a knowledge you do not want to have, arriving in pieces, each piece deniable on its own, until the whole picture assembles itself with a clarity that is almost physical in its impact. There is a particular kind of grief that accompanies financial betrayal that is different from other forms of loss. It carries within it a component of self-reproach that makes it doubly cruel. You lost money, yes, but you also, in some sense, chose to trust. And in a culture that fetishizes individual responsibility and skeptical sophistication, that choice can feel like evidence of your own foolishness, your own naivety, your own failure to protect yourself. This is profoundly unjust. The victims of fraud are not foolish people. They are, in many cases, highly intelligent, highly accomplished individuals who were deliberately targeted because of their success, deliberately cultivated because of their trust, and deliberately deceived by someone who spent enormous energy and effort perfecting the art of deception. The fault does not lie with them. It never does. But shame is not rational. It arrives regardless of where the fault actually lies. And shame silences people. It keeps them from talking to authorities. It keeps them from talking to each other. It keeps them from discovering, sometimes for years, that they are not alone in what happened to them. That the person who deceived them deceived dozens or hundreds of others with the same precision and the same apparent warmth. One of the functions that legal proceedings serve, beyond the purely punitive, is to break that silence, to create a public accounting that allows victims to place their experience within a larger narrative and understand that what happened to them was not a reflection of their judgment, but an act perpetrated against them. It is worth reflecting on the psychological life of someone like Malekzadeh, not to generate sympathy, which would be obscene given the damage caused, but because understanding the interior logic of a fraudster illuminates the nature of the crime. People who sustain fraud operations over extended periods are not simply making a series of bad choices. They are constructing and maintaining an elaborate reality, a parallel world in which the lies they tell become, through constant repetition and reinforcement, something very close to their own truth. There is a literature on this phenomenon, on the way that con artists can come genuinely to believe in the version of themselves they have created, to feel, even as the structure collapses, a kind of wounded indignation, as if the exposure itself is the injustice rather than the fraud. This does not excuse anything. Nothing excuses the sustained, deliberate exploitation of trusting people, but it explains something about how the deception could be maintained so consistently, why the face shown to investors was so convincing, why so many people who were by any measure astute and experienced came away from encounters with him feeling that they were in the presence of someone genuine. Because in some fundamental way, the performance had become the performer. The mask had fused with the face behind it, and what victims encountered was not a man carefully managing a deception, but something more complex and more unsettling. A man living inside one. The broader category of affinity fraud, of which Malekzadeh's operation is one instance, has been documented extensively by financial regulators and law enforcement agencies. The Securities and Exchange Commission has published warnings specifically addressed to communities that are frequent targets: religious communities, ethnic communities, professional communities, any group that is defined by strong internal bonds of trust and shared identity. The pattern is remarkably consistent across cases. An insider, or someone who presents themselves convincingly as an insider, leverages community trust to build an investor base. They pay early returns to establish credibility. They use community social networks to spread the reputation of the investment. And they extract money until the structure collapses or until they choose to disappear, whichever comes first. The Iranian-American community has faced this pattern with painful frequency, not because it is uniquely vulnerable in some essential way, but because it possesses precisely the qualities that make any community a target: strong internal social bonds, a tradition of doing business within the community based on trust, a degree of wariness toward outside institutions that can make internal trust even more powerful, and the accumulation of substantial personal wealth by many of its members over the decades since the community began to establish itself in the United States. These are not weaknesses, they are strengths. They become vulnerabilities only when someone chooses to exploit them, and the responsibility for that exploitation lies entirely with the exploiter. The legal proceedings that followed the exposure of Malekzadeh's activities revealed, as legal proceedings always do, the gap between the public face of the operation and its private reality. The documents, the financial records, the testimony, all of it pointed toward the same fundamental conclusion: that beneath the confident presentation and the promised returns and the air of sophisticated financial management, there was essentially nothing. The money was not being invested in the ways claimed. The returns that had been paid were not generated by successful investment strategies. They were paid from new deposits, from fresh capital brought in by new victims, recruited through the same network of trust and social endorsement that had drawn in the earlier ones. There were individuals in this story who served, without any awareness of doing so, as unwitting recruiters. These are people who had invested early, who had received their returns as promised in the beginning, and who in good faith encouraged people they loved to invest as well. The legal and moral landscape around these individuals is complex and uncomfortable. They were victims. They were also, through no fault of their own, instruments of the fraud. The damage they caused, even though it was entirely unintentional, was real and lasting. And the relationships fractured by the recruitment, the friendships and family bonds damaged when the person who recommended the investment was revealed to have recommended disaster. These represent a form of collateral damage that never appears in any financial accounting, but that constitutes perhaps the deepest wound of all. Money can be, in theory, replaced. Not easily, not quickly, not without enormous struggle. But money exists in a world of possibility in ways that trust does not. Trust, once genuinely broken, does not reconstitute itself. You can come to a kind of peace with what happened. You can choose to extend trust again in other directions. But the specific trust that was betrayed, the particular friendship or family bond that was stressed past breaking, the community's sense of its own internal safety, these things do not simply recover. They carry the scar of what happened, and the scar changes the shape of what comes after. For some victims, the practical consequences were immediate and severe. Retirement plans dissolved. Business investments that had been financed in part through expected returns from Malekzadeh's scheme suddenly found themselves without the capital they had been counting on. Medical expenses that had been anticipated to be covered were not. Educational plans for children were revised or abandoned. These are not abstract numbers on a spreadsheet. These are the specific texture of human life. The plans made around kitchen tables, the conversations about the future, the small and large decisions that had been made on the assumption that the money was real, that the investment was real, that the person managing it was real. And then the assumption was removed, and all the decisions built upon it hung briefly in the air before falling. There is something that needs to be said about the systems that are supposed to prevent this kind of harm. Financial regulators exist precisely to create accountability in spaces where individuals cannot fully protect themselves. The disclosure requirements, the registration requirements, the audit requirements, all of these exist because the history of finance is also a history of exploitation, and because the mechanisms of the free market, left entirely to themselves, are not sufficient to protect ordinary people from the predations of those who are skilled in the art of financial deception. The question of why these systems failed to catch Malekzadeh's operation before it caused the damage it caused is a legitimate and important question, even if it does not alter the fundamental story. Part of the answer lies in the private nature of the fraud. It operated within the closed social networks of the community, below the threshold of visibility that triggers regulatory scrutiny. Part of the answer lies in the fact that fraud is specifically designed to evade detection, that the fraudster is always working with full knowledge of the rules while working to violate them invisibly. And part of the answer, perhaps the most uncomfortable part, lies in the simple fact that regulatory resources are finite, and the landscape of potential fraud is vast. And the priorities of enforcement, like all priorities, involve choices about what to monitor closely and what to leave to the mechanisms of trust. The victims in the aftermath found themselves navigating a system that was, at times, poorly equipped to serve them. The process of recovering money through legal channels is slow, expensive, and uncertain. In many fraud cases, by the time the legal machinery has fully engaged and judgment has been rendered, the money itself is long gone, spent, dissipated, moved through a series of transfers that make recovery extremely difficult. The gap between the theoretical availability of justice and its practical delivery is one of the persistent failures of the legal system in its engagement with financial crime. Justice, in these cases, often arrives in the form of accountability, a public reckoning, a legal judgment, a named and documented wrong, rather than in the form of actual financial restoration. For some, that accountability matters deeply. There is meaning in the public declaration that a wrong was committed, that it was real and not imagined, that the person who committed it has been named and held responsible. For others, whose lives have been materially and permanently altered by the loss, the accounting carries a different weight. What do you do with a judgment when what you needed was the money itself? This is not a rhetorical question. It is a question that thousands of fraud victims ask themselves in the years after the legal proceedings have concluded, when the news coverage has faded and the community has moved on, as communities must, and they are left with the quiet, private work of rebuilding a financial life from a foundation that someone else destroyed. Let us not leave the children out of this account. There were children whose lives were directly affected, not because they understood what had happened in any financial sense, but because they lived inside the consequences. Families under the stress of severe financial loss behave differently. The tension is palpable. The conversations that adults think they are having privately are not private. The changes in household life, the things no longer purchased, the plans no longer made, the vacations no longer taken, the college conversations that change their tone. These register in the lives of children with a precision that we underestimate. The damage to family stability and family atmosphere that follows financial fraud extends down through generations in ways that are not easily measured but are entirely real. Michael Malekzadeh's story is, at its core, a story about the corruption of relationship. Everything he built, the social connections, the community standing, the reputation for financial sophistication, was built for the purpose of extraction. The warmth was a tool. The friendship was an instrument. The belonging that people felt in his presence was manufactured for the purpose of separating them from their savings. This is perhaps the most fundamental violation in the story, deeper even than the financial crime, because it reaches into the domain of what it means to be in relationship with other human beings. It asks the terrible question of whether what you experienced as genuine was ever anything more than performance, and it leaves that question permanently unanswered, hanging in the air like smoke long after the fire has been extinguished. The financial regulators who document affinity fraud consistently note that the best protection against it is education, not the cynical abandonment of community trust, which would destroy the very social fabric that makes community possible, but a specific, informed skepticism about financial claims that arrive through social channels. The fact that someone is recommended by a person you trust does not mean that they are trustworthy. The fact that other members of your community have reportedly received returns does not mean the investment is legitimate. The fact that someone speaks with authority and apparent expertise does not mean they have authority or expertise. These are not comfortable truths. They ask us to maintain a kind of dual consciousness, to be open and connected and trusting in our social lives, while simultaneously being rigorous and skeptical in our financial decisions, even when those two things are presented together as a single package. Regulatory agencies, including the SEC and the FBI, have worked to create outreach programs specifically targeted at communities known to be frequent targets of affinity fraud. These programs represent an acknowledgement that financial literacy is not evenly distributed, that the social mechanisms of community trust create specific vulnerabilities, and that the ordinary individual, however intelligent and accomplished, is not well positioned to evaluate the legitimacy of complex financial claims without specific tools and knowledge. Whether these programs have been sufficiently funded, sufficiently culturally sensitive, and sufficiently effective is a question that the persistence of cases like Malekzadeh's answers, at least in part, with a melancholy and instructive silence. The community itself, in the aftermath, faced the work of reconstituting its sense of internal safety. Communities that have been targeted by affinity fraud go through a period of recalibration that is painful and necessary. The question of whom to trust, how to trust, what forms of social endorsement can be relied upon. These questions do not resolve quickly. There is a period of heightened suspicion that can damage legitimate relationships and legitimate transactions, a kind of social inflammation in response to injury that, while understandable, carries its own costs. And then, gradually, a new normal emerges, one that carries, one hopes, the specific wisdom earned from the experience, without being defined entirely by it. It would be wrong to end a story like this in a place of pure devastation, not because the devastation was not real or not profound, but because the people at the center of it are not defined by what was done to them. The victims of Michael Malekzadeh's fraud are people of remarkable resilience, People who had already, in many cases, rebuilt their lives once from the ground up after leaving Iran, who carried within them a knowledge of loss and recovery that the fraud had not been able to touch. Many of them did rebuild. Not all of them, and not easily, and never in a way that fully erased what had happened. But they rebuilt. They continued. They found in each other, in the community that had been the vehicle of the fraud, also the support that made recovery possible. That is the paradox at the heart of affinity fraud. The same community bonds that were exploited are also, ultimately, the source of the healing. There is a lesson here that is worth stating plainly, even knowing that plain statements cannot fully carry the weight of everything that has been described. The lesson is not simply to be careful with money. It is something larger than that. It is about the way that trust and community and belonging, the things that make human life livable, can be turned against us by those who are willing to treat them as instruments. It is about the specific courage required to ask hard questions, even in social contexts where hard questions are unwelcome. It is about the responsibility we have to each other to speak up when something seems wrong, even when silence feels safer and easier and more socially comfortable. And it is about the people who lost. Let us be clear and specific about them, even though we are speaking in general terms. They were parents who had worked 30 years to build a retirement fund. They were small business owners who had invested savings earned through decades of early mornings and late nights. They were young professionals who had inherited money from parents who worked even harder. They were people of good faith and good judgment who encountered someone skilled at manufacturing false versions of both. They deserved better. They deserved the protection of systems that caught the fraud earlier, of social norms that made it easier to raise doubts, of a world in which the warmth someone extends toward you is what it appears to be. They did not get those things. And the story of why they did not, the story of how someone like Malekzadeh was able to do what he did for as long as he did it, is a story that our systems and our communities are still, slowly and imperfectly, trying to learn from. The darkness does not announce itself. It comes wearing the face of promise, speaking the language of dreams. And the only answer to it that we have ever found is not the abandonment of dreams or the calcification of trust, but something harder and more demanding. The cultivation of a specific, informed, and vigilant love for the people around us that includes the willingness to protect them, even from things that appear to be gifts. That willingness is the inheritance of every story like this one. It is the only inheritance that cannot be taken away.